What if the key to the kingdom of heaven that Jesus spoke of was not metaphorical, but actual? Not a reward granted after death, but a tool for unlocking capacities that lie dormant within human consciousness? And what if the early mystics knew exactly what this key was and how to use it before the institutional church declared such knowledge heretical and buried it beneath layers of doctrine designed to keep believers dependent on external authority rather than discovering their own divine nature? In the vault beneath the Vatican Library, in a section so restricted that even most cardinals do not know of its existence, there rests a collection of manuscripts that were removed from circulation during the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Texts written by the Desert Fathers and Mothers who practiced techniques of inner transformation that produced experiences so profound they threatened the emerging orthodoxy's claim that salvation could only come through the mediation of priests and sacraments. Among these forbidden texts is a treatise written in Coptic by a monk named Pachomius, and it bears the title that translates as The Key of the Inner Temple, and it describes in precise detail the spiritual technology that Jesus actually taught to his closest disciples, the practice that modern religion has either forgotten or deliberately suppressed. In the autumn of 1978, a Jesuit scholar named Father Michael Romano was granted access to the restricted vault as part of his research into early Christian mysticism, and among the hundreds of documents he was permitted to examine, he found Pachomius's manuscript tucked inside another text, as though someone long ago had hidden it there, hoping it would be overlooked by those who were systematically removing anything that contradicted the official narrative. Father Romano read the opening lines and felt his hands begin to tremble with the recognition that he had found something that could transform not just his own understanding, but the entire foundation of Christian practice if its contents were ever made public. The text began with words that seemed to echo across the centuries with the force of prophecy. I write this testimony for those who will come after, when the way of the inner temple has been forgotten and replaced with outer rituals that comfort but do not transform, that promise salvation but do not deliver liberation, that speak of the kingdom within but provide no map for finding it. I write because I was taught by those who learned directly from the ones who walked with the Master, and I know that what he taught was not belief but practice, not doctrine but technique, not faith in him but the activation of the same consciousness that he embodied, the Christ awareness that is the birthright of every human soul, but that lies dormant until the key is used to unlock the inner temple where it dwells. Father Romano read through the night, unable to stop, barely breathing as Pachomius described the key in language that was simultaneously symbolic and startlingly concrete. The key, he explained, was not an object but a practice, and the practice was what he called the conscious descent, the deliberate journey of awareness into the depths of one's own being, past the surface chatter of the thinking mind, past the emotional turbulence of the feeling self, past even the sense of individual identity, descending all the way to the ground of consciousness itself, the still point where the individual soul touched the universal spirit and recognized itself as an expression of the divine rather than as something separate from it. The Master taught us, Pachomius wrote, that the kingdom of heaven is within you, and he meant this literally, not as consolation or poetry, but as instruction. Within the human being, there exists a temple more sacred than any structure built of stone, a sanctuary where the divine presence dwells permanently, waiting only for our awareness to turn inward and discover it. But most humans live their entire lives oriented outward, seeking God in the sky or in books or in the pronouncements of those who claim authority, never realizing that what they seek is closer than their own breath, more intimate than their own thoughts, present in every moment but invisible to those who have not learned to use the key. The text described the practice in detail that Michael found both challenging and strangely familiar, as though he was reading instructions for something he had always known but had never been taught explicitly. The conscious descent required stillness first, the body brought to complete rest through postures that aligned the spine and opened the breath. The mind quieted through techniques of focused attention that prevented the usual cascade of thoughts from distracting awareness. Once this preliminary stillness was established, the practitioner would begin the descent by asking a question that seemed simple, but that carried profound power. What am I before the thought of myself arises? This question, Pachomius explained, directed awareness beneath the constructed identity, beneath the story of who we think we are, based on our history and our roles and our beliefs, pointing consciousness toward the pure awareness that existed prior to all content, the witness that observed thoughts and emotions and sensations, but was not identical with any of them. Most people, he wrote, believe they are their thoughts, or their feelings, or their body, or some combination of these. But these are all objects that appear in awareness. They come and go. They change. The awareness itself does not change. It is the constant presence, the eternal now, the ground of being that the Master called the Father, not because it is masculine, but because it is the source from which all manifestation proceeds. Udat Michael read descriptions of what happened when the descent was practiced with dedication and proper guidance, accounts that sounded like the mystical experiences recorded by saints and contemplatives across the Christian tradition, but that were presented here not as rare gifts granted to the specially chosen, but as the natural result of applying the technique correctly. Practitioners reported experiencing a dissolution of the boundary between self and other, moments when the sense of being a separate individual fell away, and what remained was a vast awareness that seemed to contain all things while being contained by nothing. They described encountering what Pachomius called the light of the uncreated, a luminosity that was not physical, but that was more real than anything perceived with physical eyes, a radiance that revealed all phenomena as expressions of a single consciousness appearing in infinite forms. And they described the transformation that resulted from regular practice of the conscious descent, changes that were not just subjective, but that manifested in their relationships and their actions in the world. Fear diminished because the awareness that had been discovered was recognized as deathless, untouched by the changes that affected the body and the personality. Compassion increased because the same awareness that looked out from behind their own eyes was recognized as the awareness looking out from behind every pair of eyes, making separation an illusion and connection the fundamental truth. Attachment to outcomes relaxed because the eternal presence that had been contacted was so fulfilling that external circumstances lost their power to provide or withhold happiness. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. But the text also included warnings, and these were what made Michael understand why the institutional church might have wanted to suppress this teaching. Pachomius wrote that those who practiced the conscious descent eventually realized they did not need intermediaries between themselves and the divine, that priests and rituals and sacred texts could be helpful guides, but were not necessary once direct access to the inner temple had been achieved. He described conflicts with the emerging church hierarchy, bishops who insisted that salvation came only through the sacraments administered by ordained clergy, who declared that the practice of inner descent was dangerous and potentially demonic because it bypassed the authority structures that the church was establishing. They fear what they cannot control, Pachomius observed, and they cannot control the direct experience of the divine that comes through the practice of the key. So they declare it heretical. They say that only Jesus could embody the Christ consciousness, that the rest of us must believe in him rather than become like him. But this contradicts what the Master actually taught. He said, "These things that I do, "You will do also and greater things than these." He said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." He said, "I and the Father are one." And when the authorities wanted to stone him for blasphemy, he quoted scripture back to them. "Is it not written in your law," I said, "you are gods?" He was not claiming exclusive divinity. He was demonstrating the divinity that is the birthright of all. And he was teaching the practice that would allow others to realize what he had realized. Michael sat back from the manuscript, his mind reeling from the implications. If this text was authentic, if it truly preserved the teaching of the early Christian contemplatives who had learned directly from those who walked with Jesus, then the entire edifice of institutional Christianity was built on a suppression, a deliberate hiding of the key that would allow believers to access the inner temple directly rather than remaining dependent on the external structures of church authority. He thought about the desert fathers and mothers, those early mystics who had fled to the Egyptian wilderness to practice contemplation in solitude, and he realized that they had not been fleeing the world, but the church, escaping the institutionalization of a teaching that was meant to liberate consciousness, not to create another system of control. He spent the next 3 months studying the manuscript in secret, practicing the technique it described, descending again and again into the depths of his own awareness, using the key of the question, "What am I before the thought of myself arises?" And he began to experience what Pachomius had described, moments when the constructed identity of Father Michael Romano dissolved, and what remained was a vast awareness that had no name and no story, that simply was, eternal and unchanging, the ground of being that all the great mystics across all traditions had contacted when they penetrated beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. The experiences terrified him at first, this dissolution of everything he had believed himself to be. But gradually he learned to trust the process, to allow the descent to take him deeper without resistance. And what he found there was not the absence of self, but the true self, not emptiness but fullness, not darkness but light, that was so bright it appeared as darkness to eyes accustomed to the dimmer illumination of conceptual thinking. He understood viscerally why the institutional church had suppressed this teaching. A person who had accessed the inner temple no longer needed external validation, no longer required priestly authority to mediate their relationship with the divine, no longer believed that salvation was something to be earned or granted, but recognized it as the eternal truth of what they had always been beneath the layers of conditioning and false identification. He knew he had to share what he had discovered, but he also knew that doing so openly would result in his excommunication, possibly his imprisonment, certainly the end of his career and his reputation. The Vatican did not tolerate challenges to its authority, and this manuscript was the ultimate challenge. Proof that the early Christians had practiced something that the institutional church had systematically suppressed in favor of doctrine and ritual that kept believers dependent on external authority. So Michael made copies of the manuscript, encrypting them and hiding them in locations around the world, and he began to teach the practice in secret to small groups of seekers who were willing to risk the consequences of accessing knowledge that the church had declared forbidden. He taught them the conscious descent, guiding them through the practice of using the key to unlock the inner temple. And he watched as they underwent the same transformation he had experienced, fear giving way to peace, separation giving way to connection, the desperate seeking for external salvation giving way to the recognition of the eternal presence that had been within them all along. One of his students was a clinical psychoanalyst who recognized immediately that what Michael was teaching was not opposed to psychological understanding, but was actually its fulfillment, the practice that allowed consciousness to penetrate beneath even the unconscious to the ground of awareness itself, where all psychological content arose and subsided. She began integrating the conscious descent into her therapeutic work, teaching clients to use the key not as a bypass of their psychological material, but as a way of developing the witnessing awareness that could hold even the most difficult emotions and memories without being overwhelmed by them. Another student was a neuroscientist who began researching the brain states associated with the practice, discovering that the conscious descent produced measurable changes in neural activity, shifts in brainwave patterns that corresponded with reported experiences of unity consciousness and dissolution of the default mode network that created the sense of separate self. He published papers that approached the practice from a purely secular perspective, avoiding religious language but describing the same territory that Pachomius had mapped 1,500 years earlier. And Michael himself continued to practice and to study, diving deeper into the manuscripts in the Vatican Vault, finding other texts that corroborated Pachomius's testimony, fragments of the original teaching that had somehow survived the systematic purging that followed Nicaea. He found references to the key in the Gospel of Thomas, sayings of Jesus that had been excluded from the canonical Gospels precisely because they pointed too directly to the practice of inner realization. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you. The kingdom of the Father is spread upon the earth, and people do not see it. He found it in the writings of Meister Eckhart, the medieval mystic who had been condemned for teaching that the ground of the soul was identical with the ground of God, that in the depths of contemplative awareness there was no difference between the human and the divine. He found it in the Cloud of Unknowing, the anonymous medieval text that taught a practice nearly identical to what Pachomius described, the descent into darkness that was actually the brilliant darkness of God's presence, undiluted by concepts or images. He found it in the Philokalia, the collection of Eastern Orthodox mystical writings that preserved practices of inner prayer designed to quiet the mind and open awareness to the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. The key had never been lost, Michael realized. It had been preserved in the mystical traditions that existed at the margins of institutional religion, practiced by those who valued direct experience over doctrinal correctness, who understood that the purpose of spiritual practice was not to earn salvation in some future heaven, but to wake up to the kingdom that was already present within. The suppression had been successful in preventing the practice from becoming widespread, in keeping the masses dependent on external authority, but it had not succeeded in destroying the teaching entirely because truth had a way of surviving, of finding those who were ready to receive it, of perpetuating itself through lineages of practitioners who passed the key from teacher to student across the generations. In his 70th year, knowing that his time was short, Michael wrote his own testament, a text that combined Pachomius's instructions with his own experiences and the discoveries of his students, creating a manual that was both ancient and contemporary, both mystical and practical. He called it The Key Rediscovered, and he arranged for it to be published posthumously, knowing that the Church would not be able to suppress it once it was released into the world through channels they could not control. He died in his sleep 3 months after completing the manuscript, and those who found him said that his face bore an expression of such peace that it seemed he had died while experiencing the eternal awareness he had spent his last decades teaching others to access. The manuscript was published as he had arranged, and it spread through networks of seekers and practitioners, people who were hungry for a spirituality that offered direct access rather than institutional mediation, who wanted to experience the kingdom within rather than just believing in its existence. The institutional church condemned the text, of course, declaring it a misrepresentation of Christian teaching, but the condemnation only drew more attention to it, and people began practicing the conscious descent in meditation groups and contemplative circles around the world. They discovered what Pachomius and Michael had discovered, that the key worked, that regular practice of asking, "What am I?" before the thought of myself arises, and following awareness into the depths of being produced, the dissolution of the separate self, and the recognition of the eternal presence that had been within them all along, the Christ consciousness that Jesus had embodied and had taught his disciples to embody, not through belief, but through practice, not through faith in external salvation, but through direct realization of the kingdom within. And the teaching continues to spread, not as a new religion, but as a restoration of what was original, not as a rejection of Christianity, but as a remembrance of what Christianity was before it became institutionalized, the key that unlocks the inner temple where the divine presence dwells permanently, waiting only for our awareness to turn inward and discover what was never actually lost but only forgotten. The truth that we are not separate from God, but expressions of the one consciousness, appearing as many, the realization that transforms everything while changing nothing, that reveals heaven not as a distant destination, but as a present reality, that demonstrates the kingdom is not coming in the future, but is already here, spread upon the earth, within every human heart, accessible through the key that modern religion ignores, but that the mystics of every tradition have used to unlock the door between the temporal and the eternal, between the human and the divine, between the illusion of separation and the truth of absolute unity. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.